My name is Catherine Augustine, and I am the director of the RAND Corporation office here in Pittsburgh. I'm also part of the steering committee for the summit, and I'm so glad that it's here. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to Pittsburgh if you're from somewhere else. And I'm sure, like me, you've been riveted thus far and are excited about all of the learning and the action items that will come out of the summit. And I'm here to briefly introduce the next conversation, and it will be led by Dr. Cynthia Miller Idris, who will be posing questions to Dr. Joshua Geltzer. And they are both superstars. Cynthia is a professor of education and sociology at American University, and there she runs the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. And she actually has some of her undergraduates here with her because they won a contest centered on eradicating hate, and they will be showing a video that they created of an animated, I'm not sure if it's one duck or multiple ducks tomorrow, so please take a peek at that. And she will be posing questions to Josh, who probably does not need an introduction here. As Laura said earlier, he is the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Homeland Security Advisor. And he was promoted to that from being the Special Assistant to the President and the Special Advisor to the Homeland Security Advisor. And when he was in that role, he oversaw the development of the U.S. government's first ever national strategy on countering domestic terrorism. So both of these folks know whereof they speak, and join me in welcoming Cynthia to the stage and Josh to the monitor.
Great, thank you. Hopefully Josh will be coming up shortly. I'm going to sit down. And hi, Josh. There you are, very big on the screen. So I can see you down below me, so I'm going to sort of face toward you, and you're facing out at a large ballroom. I don't know if you can see it, with lots and lots of people here who are eager to hear from you. So I'm very happy to be in this conversation with you for lots of reasons. It's always good to talk with you, but especially on the heels of last week's first ever summit on hate-fueled violence, at the United We Stand summit that the Biden administration held. And so it was, it really was a unique event in many ways. And I was wondering if you could start off by just telling folks a little bit about the impetus behind that and what it means now to have the administration place such a high priority on this issue.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Let me ask first, can you hear me okay? Am I coming through all right?
Yes, we can hear you great. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, I'm grateful for the kind introductions. I'm grateful really for the chance to participate in this overall. I'm sorry not to be there in person, as much for myself as for all of you, because it's an extraordinary gathering and one with experts and stakeholders who work these issues so hard and know so much about them and care so much about them. And I'm privileged to even be able to join you for a little while. And thanks for asking about the summit. Thanks for traveling, changing your own travel schedule as you and I worked out to be a key part of that summit, Cynthia, which you absolutely were, and we were grateful to have you. And look, I actually wanted to start by reading just two sentences from the president's remarks at the summit to begin answering that question. This is what he said. He said, everyone has a role to play in this story, the story of how this country overcomes the challenge posed by hate-fueled violence. Whether you're a researcher seeking to understand the causes of hate-fueled violence, a philanthropist seeking to fund that research, or a concerned neighbor bearing witness to it, we must collectively condemn those seeking mainstream violence or the threat of violence. And I think that gets at what we were really trying to do with the summit. All of us who work on these issues are aware that there are gatherings like the one that I'm so honored to be part of right now, in which experts who work on these issues day in and day out gather to figure out how to get better, to learn from each other. We're aware of other gatherings, including ones I've had the privilege to be part of even in the past week or two. The gathering in the Pacific Northwest that Mary McCord, who I think is with you all there, helped to convene about addressing political violence. Our goal is to do what the White House can do, which is spotlight the issue, which is energize an even broader coalition to say that there are really two things. One, there's what's addressed by the national strategy. Acts of violence, threats of violence that rise to the level of being characterized as domestic terrorism or the somewhat overlapping category of hate crimes. We need to do more on that. And then in addition, as the president said last week here, but also after the awful attack in Buffalo, there was a broader acquiescence in and at times outright echoing of the sort of ideas and language that are then pointed to by those who engage in acts of violence. And we need as a society, as a polity, to unite in opposition to that sort of hate.
Great, thanks, Josh. There were a lot of interesting initiatives, sort of signature new funding initiatives that were made public or announced by President Biden himself and other members of his administration on Thursday at the summit. Can you talk a little bit about that for the audience, especially folks who might not be aware of it or aware of what was announced, and kind of lay out what that looks like in practical terms? Because there were some, particularly from places outside of the traditional national security space, we had some real presence there from the arts, from AmeriCorps, and also talk of HHS and DOE. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that for folks here.
No, I'm glad to, and I appreciate your spotlighting it, because that too was part of the goal of the summit, and frankly something that we also tried to incorporate into the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, which is to recognize that the roots, the origins of this awful set of acts that we call hate-fueled violence, domestic terrorism, hate crimes, that those roots run really deep, which means the responses to it and those who can help prevent individuals from getting to the point of radicalizing to violence and then at some point becoming law enforcement's prerogative to attempt to identify, disrupt, and in many cases punish, that we need that broader set of actors at the table. So yes, you heard funding initiatives announced in conjunction with the summit that came from the traditional security parts of the government. For example, the Department of Homeland Security announced the recipients of the latest cycle, the next cycle of its $20 million in TVTP, Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention funding. And I think there are some really novel grantees and some great work that the government will be supporting through that. But you also saw, for example, Michael Smith, AmeriCorps, lifting up the role that they believe they can play and that we believe they can play in addressing those roots of this phenomenon, which in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases can stem back to deepening polarizations in this country, deepening caricatures of the other, a sense of disconnectedness from those who at one point just seem a different part of American society, and then especially in dark corners of the internet, but also elsewhere, can be demonized and dehumanized, and ultimately, in too many cases, that then becomes actual targets of violence, quite literally targets and victims. And to try to get to a point where Americans feel that they are, as the name of the summit suggests, united by, at a minimum, the notion that we resolve our differences not through violence, but through peace. That's what we were trying to get at, but that's where we think there is much to be contributed by AmeriCorps, HHS, education, and I would emphasize this quite strongly, many of the key participants in the summit who are not from government at all, but who are instead philanthropy, the private sector, and entities like the tech sector entities that announce a number of contributions themselves to tackling this problem.
Terrific, thanks, Josh. You know, this summit came about 15 months or so after the administration issued what was the first ever national strategy on combating domestic terrorism. Can you talk a little bit more about what remains to be implemented, or what are the next steps in implementing the kind of strategy laid out in that document? How does that relate to the summit, and what else is, what should people expect to see next?
So I think there are things that we have been able to move on relatively quickly in terms of implementing that strategy, and that's by design, given the urgency of the problem. So we are now getting out information, analysis on threats to a wider cross-section of not just the federal family, but also state and local, in many cases, private sector partners. And we're getting that information out in new ways, using technology, new smartphone apps to disseminate the latest threat reporting or analysis of what domestic terrorists are doing to try to recruit and radicalize. That's happening. It's never done. That information needs to keep flowing. We need to keep up with the threat. But I think we've created some of the structures that can contribute to it, as well as some of the technological mechanisms to deliver it in meaningful ways. Another piece that I think we're able to move on relatively quickly is build the sort of law enforcement apparatus and prioritization that can enhance expertise and resourcing on this problem. So that includes someone dedicated to these issues within the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department. That includes a domestic terrorism specific unit that AAG Matt Olson announced within the counterterrorism section of the National Security Division. Then there are pieces that they're very designed long-term projects. And maybe here in particular, I would point to the fourth pillar of the strategy. We acknowledge there, as I think we have to acknowledge, that there are problems that are both bigger than domestic terrorism, but they contribute to domestic terrorism as we confront it today. Problems of racism, problems of easy access to a wide array of firearms, problems of disinformation and how it can exacerbate the polarization that I was mentioning earlier. We do have things we're doing to try to get at each of those. Landmark legislation on firearms, new funding for digital literacy projects. But there's a long way to go on those issues. We acknowledged at the beginning of this administration there would be a long way to go, but we're still at it.
Terrific. Thanks, Josh. And we have just, I think, about 4 minutes left. I know this is a very tight conversation. I will just pivot to thinking about what other kinds of, thinking about who's in the room here, a broad variety of civil society actors, philanthropists, government folks, educators. Can you think about, what other things do you think are important for this audience to know in terms of both what's needed in the space, what is it that others of us outside of government can and should be doing to make some of these initiatives be more successful?
Here I would echo in particular what the president said when he went up to Buffalo after the awful attack there. And he talked about how beyond the acts of violence themselves, beyond the threats of violence, there is seeping into our political dialogue, seeping into our culture in some ways, seeping into our media, or at least portions of it, certain notions, certain ideologies that have not just abhorrent elements, at least to many of us, but have the seeds of violence in them. There is a reason that after domestic terrorism attacks, we see those who've undertaken them point to notions of the supremacy of a certain race, point to the dehumanizing of immigrants, point to the denigration of certain nationalities, religions, all sorts of things that are the objects of hate that this group is spending these days talking about. And that lays the seeds for those who then obsess over those and in some cases become violent. And that takes day by day confronting and calling out. That takes saying in the seeds of a notion of accelerationism or replacement theory are the acts of violence that then come and people point back to those notions. And to energize those who are gathered in Pittsburgh for this extraordinary event, but also those that they'll go and interact with when you all leave and say, when we see that, wherever we come from, we need to confront it and out it for what it is and connect it to the threats we're seeing. I think that's very important.
Terrific. Last question for you as we head into concluding our conversation here today. What challenges do you see? What are the biggest hurdles ahead? And what are you looking toward as you move into the next couple of years?
So here I'll pick up on the threat assessment that was provided by the intelligence community and law enforcement last spring as the basis for our work on the domestic terrorism strategy. We embedded in the strategy the unclassified summary of that work. And one thing that the experts pointed to were the ways in which hot button issues, in some cases long-standing hot button issues like migration, in some cases newer issues like at the time especially COVID-related restrictions and responses. Those would have once perhaps been the subject of heated debates. They might have divided Americans, they might have divided American political parties, but they were now becoming that around which conversations among violent extremists revolve. And that there would be a steady stream of issues like that would become part of the narrative that then gets injected into these conversations among those who might turn violent. And we are seeing it. We're seeing it as new issues come to the fore nationally, whether they're reproductive rights or whether they remain issues like how to handle both the challenge and opportunity associated with migration to this country. And so I think it is part of the evolving nature of the threat that those issues, and they're going to be next ones we can't even predict yet, become part of a conversation in which some have the instinct try to radicalize and recruit others to turn violent with them. And it's on all of us who do this work to keep up with that evolution and to figure out how to respond in a way that leaves plenty of room for freedom of speech and association, even the expression of views some of us might abhor, but does reduce the violence we're seeing.
Anything else you want this audience to know? Any final thoughts? Anything I have not asked that you wished that I would ask?
You know, I think our message from here is we want to understand how we can be a better partner to those outside the federal government doing this work. That was also part of the goal of the summit. It's why we had mayors. It's why we had nonprofits. It's why we had business leaders come and talk about this at the White House for a day. But we want it to be much more than a day. And so we are eager to know what is sometimes just the small thing that those of us in federal government can do to support or amplify or help the really big thing that those outside government are doing. And so we are eager to understand, is it grant dollars? Is it showing that we care? Is it traveling? Is it using our voice to support something? Is it providing information that we may well have within the government on threat analysis or the latest tactics to recruit and radicalize, that if we just knew there was this other audience that wanted it for their own attempts to tackle this problem, we might well be able to find a way to get to them. So help us be a better partner to all of you who work in this field.
Great, thanks Josh. And thank all of you for joining us over the lunch hour. I know this was a busy day for you and that you're taking important time away from other things to have this conversation, and I think everyone appreciates it, and we'll just offer a round of applause to you for taking the time. Thanks very much.